We were thinking about how to start the talk today, and we thought the best way to do it was to start thinking a little bit about our own journeys with restorative justice. So my name is Catherine Rousell. I'm a forensic psychologist, and my restorative justice journey began in the early 2000s. I was employed within youth justice settings for about 16 years, working with young people who both harmed and working with the people who were affected by that harm. In 2017, I joined the Mint House as a trustee, and that's been a wonderful experience. And in 2015, I started my journey to train as a psychologist. That's ended with me being employed at the Oxford Clinic, which is a male medium secure unit. Today, I'm really looking forward to hearing from both Estelle and Gerard. I think they're going to have some really valuable contributions to make to kind of help us think about how restorative practice can be applied within mental health settings. Estelle, can you tell us about how you first heard about restorative justice?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Catherine. I'm blown away by the faces I'm seeing on the screen here. It's absolutely wonderful to see so many familiar faces and to meet so many new people interested today. So how did we start? I'm sort of slightly representing Broadmoor Hospital and High Secure and our West London forensic services. I see there's some colleagues in the call who've joined the call today. So standing on the shoulders of giants, just restorative practice is about teamwork, and there's so many people that are coming to mind as I'm thinking about our journey. But we started with an invitation from Gerard to join Sussex Partnership in a wonderful event in I think it was about 2014. So about 10 years ago, slightly less. We came to an event. It was an unusual occasion for us in High Secure because psychology and security joined together in the same car. I can't think of another time when that's happened. And we came to the event at which Andy Cook was speaking and Gerard was speaking, and it sort of blew our minds. We listened to the story of Ray and Vi Donovan, and I guess there would be a number of people on the call who have also had that journey, and we were so moved and so mind blown by their courage and our hope to return to our organisation and be inspired to think about how we could introduce restorative practices. I was in the car with a colleague called Matthew Wilding. Matthew is really good at transformation, both in nursing and security. And we, the one thing that happened though was we lost our way. We lost our way on the way back. We were so enthused. But what happened next was we re-invited Ray and Vi to come to our organisation and talk with us. And from there we developed training, which we'll talk about this morning, and our journey followed from that point. I'm going to hand over to Gerard, I think, to tell us about his journey.
Thanks, Estelle and Catherine. And I agree, Estelle, it's so lovely to see so many familiar faces on the call from across the world and even Australia. I think my restorative awareness really began with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, where I was working as a clinical psychologist in a hospital in Cape Town at the time that was running. And so became aware of the concepts and the ideas behind restorative justice. But also, I think there's a really strong connection with working in a democratic therapeutic community, something about the way in which in therapeutic environments and spaces, there's a recognition of how individual acts, which might even be towards oneself, actually have a ripple in a community, and that we're always in some way accountable to community, and that we need structures in which we hold each other together in spaces. So I think that's another therapeutic link with the restorative justice that just spoke to me and appealed. And then going a little bit further back than 2014, Estelle joined myself and Debbie Allred, and we had a little collective that were working on how to implement recovery in forensic mental health settings. And in fact, it's lovely to see people on the call from those days. I see Richard and Kate on the call. And so it actually already back then, we were trying to think about a way in which to articulate the specific offender aspects of a recovery journey. And in fact, when Debbie and I were thinking about how to think about the offender-related recovery journey, we even thought of the term restorative recovery, but then decided that it wasn't actually specific enough, and that we've ended up with a clumsy term, offender recovery, which in some ways also doesn't really work. But it was there from the beginning. But it was only really when doing training as restorative justice conference facilitators in Sussex in 2012 with Henry Kiernan, who is another one of the shoulders that we stand on, Estelle, in this restorative journey. And of course, then Henry introduced me to Ray and Vi, and they then contributed to the momentum that we were gathering. And in fact, I think I can see Morna on the call as well from Sussex, who was also involved at that time and in the training. So it's really been a journey of exploring and deepening an understanding of how do people recover from having harmed, and thinking then about the value of restorative processes in that.
Thank you both. Estelle, would it be okay for you to tell us a little bit more about where you're based?
For sure. And I don't know if you were going to actually show a picture of that. So one of the things we noticed when we were preparing the slides is that our buildings look shiny and new. So people may know that in 2019, Broadmoor Hospital moved up the road from one part of the hill to a new part of the hill. So you can see it there on the top left-hand side of your screen. I assume it's the left-hand side. That is the inner core of the central building in the new Broadmoor Hospital, and in the centre there's the new entrance. And we have a beautiful room that overlooks the valley with it's a multi-faith room with the window there on the right. So that has happened since we started the restorative journey in addition. And I guess it's something, just thinking about the value placed on the importance of environment, of calm, of restorative experience, the gardens there that make a difference to mental health care generally. So we're very fortunate to be where we are. And similarly, the Three Bridges unit pictured there and the other part of the picture is our medium secure services in West London. They've also moved into upgraded premises across the board, and have also commenced the restorative journey. It's more difficult. One thing we might come back to thinking about, is slightly more difficult on disparate sites. So there's 23 sites in West London to cover in terms of thinking about restorative practices across the board. But that's I'll come back to that. So yeah, just to say, West London, that's West London's pitch or patch, mostly in the three boroughs of Hammersmith and Fulham, Ealing and Hounslow, and then out here, I'm actually sitting out here in Berkshire, East Berkshire at the moment. So that's us. And hand back to Catherine. Thank you.
Thanks, Estelle. And how about yourself, Gerard? Where are you at the moment?
So I'm talking to you from the Bethlehem Hospital, where we also have wonderful grounds, Estelle, and patients are able to benefit from being able to be in natural environments. But we aren't so new. I'm going to make a virtue of being very old. So the Bethlehem being a claim to being the oldest psychiatric hospital in the world, not at this site, but in where it started in Liverpool Street in 1274. But if we go to the next slide, Catherine, then that is our new, well, more than 10 years old now, medium secure unit, River House, where I'm mainly based for my work, and also working with my colleague Finn Swanepoel, who's also on the call with us. And it's really, I think it's only possible to be here and talking about restorative practice because of the work, what Finn's been able to achieve as a restorative justice practitioner in our service. So I'm really here representing us both.
Thank you very much, Gerard. So I think now we're going to just have a look at the national picture.
Yes, we thought that it might be useful just to say very few brief words about the national context, because recognizing the Mint House, thank you for this opportunity to talk on a Mint House platform that you draw restorative practitioners from across the world and who might not be familiar with forensic mental health services in the UK. So the map on the right-hand side shows that there are a few units dotted around Northern Ireland, Ireland and Scotland, but the majority of medium and low secure services are in the Midlands and in the south of England. There are 3 high secure facilities, of course, Estelle representing one of them, but those aren't, I don't think, represented necessarily on this map. But there is a very large number of services, hundreds and hundreds of wards, and there are community teams as well. And the medium low secure community and prison services subscribe to Royal College of Psychiatry Quality Network, where there are standards for service delivery. And that is actually a relevant point that we hopefully will come back to later.
Yeah. So I think we're just looking at restorative justice and restorative practices.
Estelle's on mute.
I apologize. I was trying to, yes, thank you, Catherine. So this will not be unfamiliar to most of you on the call, but just as a grounding reminder, what do we mean by restorative justice and restorative practices? We're in the business of learning up, a growing social movement really to institutionalize peaceful approaches to harm, to problem solving, and to thinking about violations of legal and human rights. These range, as Gerard mentioned in his introduction, from international peacemaking tribunals such as the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to innovations within the criminal and justice systems across schools, in social services and in communities. And this movement implies a wide range of applications and spectrum of practices, and very much a process where all stakeholders affected by an injustice have an opportunity to discuss how they're affected by that injustice and to decide what should be done to repair the harm. So how can we give victims the chance to meet or communicate with offenders to explain the real impact of what's happened to them, empower them and give them a voice? Holding offenders to account for what they've done and taking responsibility, making amends. When we're talking about moving into forensic mental health services, obviously there are additional features that we will be exploring today. Thinking, I'd like to perhaps move on, perhaps to the next slide, to think about the different types of restorative practice. So thinking about restorative RJ as an intervention, as I've just mentioned, the process by which people would engage to meet with and communicate about what's happened for them. And there's a range of different processes within that have a very long history, and such as victim offender mediation, which is around dialoguing, and restorative justice conferencing. And we will come back to just some examples of those processes in mental health, in our mental health services. Moving forwards to the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Gerard, but why is it so important to introduce restorative justice into forensic mental health? Over to Gerard.
Thanks, Estelle. And I think we wanted to include that reminder of the broad spectrum of restorative thinking, different ways of being restorative, because of course restorative principles have been operationalized in conferencing and in mediation formats. But one of the ways in which that, in a way, that paradigm has been critiqued has been saying that it risks institutionalizing who is the harmer and who's the harmed. So the offender and the victim idea. And we feel really that it's very important, as much as we want to promote the introduction of these interventions, RJ as an intervention into forensic mental health and mental health in general, that we don't do that in a naive and simplistic way, that it's not just another technology, that it is really about social justice and about peace building and communication and recognizing harm and people's stories, how people come to be in forensic mental health settings, where labels are not so easily applied, not so simply applied, that we need to think much more broadly and with the social consciousness and awareness about what it is that we want to promote in introducing restorative practice and justice. But moving on to the next slide, that in a way, the primary reason certainly I've come to this position for introducing restorative practice into mental health settings is so that victims can exercise their right to restorative justice, and even if the person who's harmed them is a mental health service user. So I think up until now, so often when someone's been harmed by someone who's has a severe and enduring mental illness, either the fact of coming out of the parole system and into a mental health tribunal system in which victims have less of a voice, or the assumption that it's more difficult to access, has often meant that victims are deprived of their voice. And I feel it's really important for us to embrace the new code of practice for victims, the Victims Code, in which rights 3 and 4 both make reference to access to information about restorative justice, and then processes by which access is enabled. So not just for rehabilitation. But I think this will segue into our next slide, that and I think it's one back, Catherine, we might have missed over a slide. Oh, there might be one missing there, but not to worry. So I think that when Estelle and I were thinking about what to talk about this morning, that what we wanted to really acknowledge is that there's been a long interest in introducing restorative practice into mental health settings and forensic mental health. And in fact, Marion Liebman is on the call, and Marion has been writing about restorative justice and how it works for years and years, and as an art therapist has long wanted to see, you know, restorative justice introduced and has made efforts. But actually it is a very, very difficult thing to do, and it's very difficult for very good reasons. And so we thought that actually wanted to take seriously those potential obstacles and not just pretend that they aren't there as bumps in the road, but that we need to address them directly. And that we thought there were 4 principal difficulties. The first is the issue of mental capacity. The other is the issue of professional gatekeeping, then professional responsibilities, but then also the issue of preparation. But starting specifically looking at this issue of mental capacity, I think that I was going to pause there for a moment and hand over to you, Estelle.
Okay, thank you, Gerard. Yeah, so the first issue, as Gerard was saying, that might be an impediment, that would be an idea that we might hold, that patients don't have the mental capacity for moral responsibility. But I suppose what we want to share with you to reflect on is the idea that most mental health disposals are diminished responsibility, but that doesn't mean no responsibility. So the perennial doubt that psychiatric patients have the mental capacity to account for their actions, but no moral responsibility, as I suppose what we were seeking to unpack. So our courts almost always attribute some guilt to the offender, even if it is a mental health disposal. So we'd be wrong to exclude some accountability, even in this situation. We have found that patients with diminished responsibility conviction worry that if they take responsibility in restorative justice, that might undermine their diminished. That's been a position that that has been encountered. But actually, I guess the importance of working through the significance of taking account makes a difference to them and their lives of others has been something that we've sought to privilege, and has been always a key message from the very early days. When I do remember Ray and Vi saying, but shouldn't people in your service also have this opportunity to acknowledge the harm that's been experienced by those people that at a time when their mental state was different to how it might be now, or how they live with that mental state in addition to dealing with behaviour that is related to it. So what are the solutions? The opportunity to acknowledge the harm experienced by victims, are using that term, but people who've experienced harm at the hands of other people that we're working with, is fundamentally important. how we talk about taking responsibility going forwards, how do we try to stay safe in the future, is very much often what victims want, and want to be able to communicate about that. And how do we support victims, including those who are in the services, because we're working with people who are both perpetrators and victims so often. That would be very familiar to most of us in forensic settings, to understand how mental health issues may affect expression of concern or empathy, and how we might work forwards with that in terms of our intervention. So we're trying to tackle the obstacle of diminished responsibility by unpacking that and thinking about it not as an absolute, but something that we can work with. Back to Gerard for obstacle 2.
So yes, this is the issue of professional gatekeeping. So one of the challenges that we've encountered is that mental health professionals often don't really know or understand very much about the evidence base for restorative justice in the general population. So not then understanding how it might be helpful to our client group. And obviously, to be fair, there is very limited evidence base within a mental health population. Although, of course, because mental health difficulties are so ubiquitous across our communities, it's not as if no one has mental health difficulties, but certainly that has been a kind of an invisible layer of work, I think, in the restorative justice community, the way in which mental health difficulties are, do have challenges that need to be overcome. But that certainly has been one of the obstacles we have encountered. And so it's important to be able to make the case as to what the benefits are, and to not necessarily be blown off course by a limited understanding, but to persevere in being able to promote restorative justice practice through teaching, applications, case studies, talks like this, which are a great opportunity to get the message out there. But then for the services that are starting, and which we hope will continue to start, to evaluate, to publish, and to undertake formal research in order to make the case for restorative approaches. So I think then we're on to the next point. Now, Estelle, if it's all right, I'll start with this one and then see if you want to add. I mean, this is something that I think that is a really serious obstacle that we do need to acknowledge, and that is the professional responsibility, the ethical duty for professionals in mental health settings to, first of all, do no harm. And where there is a limited evidence base for restorative justice interventions in mental health, there's a legitimate question about how can we use these techniques if actually they may cause difficulties, they may cause stress. And that's partly that we know that our patients, people with mental health difficulties, have got significant vulnerabilities. And as much as one of the myths about restorative justice is that it's the soft option, other more realistic appraisals are that it's actually a severe form of justice. It can be it's intended to be emotionally impactful. And if people have mental health difficulties, are struggling with notions of issues like toxic shame or even morbid guilt that give rise to their mental health difficulties, we need to tread very warily on interventions that may increase shame. Through, even if we think it's reintegrative shaming, we do need to be very wary of that. So in terms of solutions, what it is that we're finding is that, of course, it's really important to go at a pace that accommodates mental health needs. And what we're finding in our casework is that you need to go perhaps more slowly, it takes longer, and that there may be starting and stopping as mental health, mental states fluctuate. You begin and stop. And victims, people who have been harmed and who are participating, need to be prepared for that. That it might need to go at the person who harmed them's pace, because it can't just be about their needs as well. But what we've also developed is models that hopefully we'll talk about, where we've integrated clinical support. So it's not something that's just left to the RJ practitioners. Clinicians need to understand the process and be up alongside the practitioners. And then, of course, family and peer support. And this is where it's so important that restorative interventions are not just about two individuals, but it's a community that's acknowledging harm and holding both the victim and the patient in a community of containment. So I think our next point, the issue of preparation.
Did you want me to carry on, Gerard? So I think just building on that, I suppose it was what's reminding me of is just how anxiety provoking it can be for people to hold some of those issues, particularly in forensic mental health settings. The idea that, oh no, we can't possibly do that, can we? Sort of feeling. But how do we step forwards into making those opportunities available to people with all of the corollaries, and ensure that that anxiety is well managed? And I guess some of the solutions relate to building awareness and preparation into our programs and integrating the skills for restorative justice into those developments. So this is, I guess, of course, people will have fear and may not know how they're going to be, how they will cope, but the preparation elements to the work is critical. I don't know if Gerard, you wanted to comment on or build on the importance of the fact that we do this as new territory, in the sense that we're almost building practice-based evidence of doing this being at the stage of lacking a theory of rehabilitation. But I don't know if you wanted to add there on that point, Gerard.
Yeah, thanks. So I suppose it's the idea that how restorative justice interventions as a meeting, as a conference or a mediation, how does that actually bring about change? And that it's a bit of a black box, but that rehabilitation in offender settings actually often involve a very structured and progressive development of a skill set. And that is something that we've been learning over time, is actually that if you, it's a bit like having a whole school approach to implementing restorative justice and restorative practice in a school, is that you need to embed it in restorative conversations, restorative dialogues, effective statements, that actually there is a stepwise process that people can be led on to be prepared for conferencing to get there. And it's not just that one element that will make all the difference. And then, of course, the other, which is the working through, is how do you support change in an ongoing way after conferencing or after shuttle RJ or exchange of letters, that it can't just be a moment in time. There has to be an extended process in order to integrate this work into change processes.
Thanks, Gerard. So just, I think if we move to the next slide, so where there isn't that preparation, obviously it's much more difficult to see how that could work. And of course, that is anxiety provoking if we haven't prepared well. So just a reminder then at this point that what restorative conferencing in mental health and any other setting is about the mission to address and repair harm if everyone's signed up for that, focusing on the future and not the past, the opportunity to participate without any coercion, and this being an accessible process. The neutrality is important, and the safety absolutely critical in mental health services. This notion of being trauma informed. So this is a phrase that is much more prevalent than now than it was perhaps even 10 years ago, when we were thinking more restoratively. We were thinking of introducing restorative practice, certainly in high security. Not compounding of social injury, one trauma on top of another, that we operate in a way that is sensitive to trauma history and put trauma at center stage in many ways, and the whole process being respectful. So those are our foundations for, there's a very minimum for restorative justice conferencing. And what we're learning and what we're wanting to share is that there are some additional adaptations in mental health settings, sometimes known in the RJC literature as a sensitive case material. So how do we go about ensuring people are prepared and ready? Obviously, we might turn to training, but we need to be working with people who are trained to appreciate the complexity and understand and foreground trauma for the histories of people involved, and the impact of the process as well on the people included. How do we make sure that we prepare to extensively include the seriousness and the impact of the history and the situation, the passage of time, as Gerard mentioned, mental states, instabilities as they may come and go, and build those into, we might do more risk assessment or preparation, safety assessment in advance of meetings in mental health settings. And then very critically, how do we offer support, as Gerard was saying as well, to the wider system? So we're going to share a case example just to show how it's nested within the wider system, all focused on the process of repair, not avoidance, not separate everybody, but how might we bring people together and sustain the repair? And that's often very critical. Henry's always reminding us in our supervision sessions about follow-up. How do we promote the adherence to the plans that we've made, and how do we make adjustments, fine-tune it to allow for mental state variation? So those 4 additions are seeming to us really critical to be able to, and our colleagues in Holland and in other places, how do we include those to make adaptations for sensitive case material? I'm not sure if the next slide takes us to an example. Oh, I don't know what happens. I don't know if that, I guess maybe just building on this slide then, just so thinking about the wider context. So we've talked about the need to embed the restorative practices. One of the things that trauma-informed working helps us very much with is the notion of the impact on staff in a setting. So, and very often that, in fact, that was where we started at Broadmoor, is that often staff are victims as well in settings where there's high rates of violence against staff. How do we work with resolution ideas and workplace culture to embed that widely? So there was a wonderful talk at the Oxford at the Mint House about the just culture work that's gone on in Merseyside to help introduce, I suppose, multiple perspectives and encourage restorative accountability and learning, working with those notions of civility and respect for the workforce, and look after our staff to think in terms of using those trauma-informed principles. Are we working in a safe way? So a lot of the work that we've done is around training staff in preparation to be able to engage, and we've got different levels of that, so that you might just have an awareness training, which would be different to actually facilitating full conferences, which is the 4-day training that Henry offers. But also more widely, even don't be a bystander means sort of picking up on some of the issues that we see in services where there's opportunity for repair, and noting I suppose perhaps lack of civility or lack of compassion, and promoting those principles across the board. Sorry, yes, I think there was a case example, and it may be the next slide. Oh no, it's disappeared. Perhaps we can go back to it. I don't know, Catherine, if we might just travel back a little bit in the slides, maybe two slides. Oh, it's disappeared. Is it later?
No, it isn't. I wonder, Estelle, because we are behind on our timescale, in order for us to leave time for discussion, maybe sure. we'll skip. We'll
move on. So swiftly handing over to hear about sycamore. Yeah, sure.
Great, thanks, Estelle. So no, I think it's really helpful what you've said about how restorative practices, if they're going to work and if they're going to be embedded, can't just be about the patient harmed relationship, that actually that harm continues in the organization, and that we need to attend to the needs of our staff team in order for them to be restorative. And that's certainly something that we've come to at South London and Maudsley. But in a way, our journey began really with in a different place to where yours was able to begin, because I think at West London you were able to start with training a cohort of staff in restorative justice conference facilitating, and of course that is a cornerstone, I think, of getting going. But for us, because at the time there wasn't a particular appetite for new training, but there was an appetite for a developing interventions program, and so I'm enormously grateful to Prison Fellowship that they agreed that we could run Sycamore Tree at the Bethlehem Hospital for the first time in a mental health setting. And enormously grateful for so many reasons, but one of them is that Finn volunteered to be the tutor for the program, and that is how we met and started working together, and the story began. But actually there's two key threads to the sycamore tree that were fundamental in changing the narrative for us in restorative work. And the first of those was that in preparation for inviting patients to participate as learners in the sycamore tree, Finn did a whole series of interviews to assess for readiness to participate. And in those interviews, the questions asked, have you ever thought of meeting your victim? And our patients were blown away. They were absolutely shocked that the question should be asked, because mostly in our services, we spend so much energy trying to make sure that people who have caused offences never meet their victims again. You know, it's something that just shouldn't happen. It's it's unthinkable. It's a mistake in a way. It's a failure of safeguarding if it was to happen. And so introducing just that question is almost like the yeast in a system where you suddenly think, oh my goodness, that's possible. And in fact, some of our patients said they were surprised that it had taken so long to be asked. And then, of course, the other thing that the sycamore tree does is that it brings in victim representatives to talk with patients, to talk with participants and learners about their experience of victimization, but not only victimization, also a restorative journey. The fact that they are the victims who speak go forward. And, we had participants who had been in hospital for 20 years and they gave us feedback saying, in 20 years, I've never met a victim. Now, they themselves may have been victims and they may be in a room next door to someone who's a victim, because of course, our patients are so often victims as well, but they aren't necessarily identified as such. So that was an astonishing experience for our patients too. But what we also learned from that was that about 2/3 of our patient population was suitable to be referred to Sycamore at the time, and about 1/3 of the patient population at that time were able to participate. But what that meant was that 2/3 didn't have access. And what we realized was that Sycamore Tree was impactful and that we needed a stepping stone towards being able to participate in a hard-hitting program like Sycamore, which I think takes us to our next slide. Yes, so Finn and I, together with some peer trainers from the Recovery College, a man and a woman, so that we were, we were including gender sensitivity. We developed a recovery college course called Kintsugi, based on the Japanese notion of golden repair, which is when there's a ceramic that gets broken, it gets repaired with gold lacquer. And there's a whole philosophy behind that, which is to honor the journey, don't hide the cracks. And we use that to develop a program that addresses in our patients' experience of victimization themselves and also their experience of stigmatization. So they make an object that represents something, and then they decorate it in order to personalize it, and then they break the object, and they know they're going to do this, so they've signed up for it, and then they have an opportunity to repair. And then to reflect on the process. And what we've intended that to be is to be part of that rehabilitation structure as a stepping stone towards thinking first about, whether I'm a patient that feels identified with being a victim, to being able to think about how their victimhood, their own trauma, might have led to other people's being victimized, to other people experiencing trauma. So the idea that pain that isn't transformed is transferred, to really drill down into what structure would address that in an intervention program, and therefore raising victim awareness. So I'm going to speed up a bit now, Catherine, on to the next slide. So I must say, though, that and this is one of the ways in which our service has been different to most of the services that have started with restorative work in the UK, certainly, and I think there's only a few other exceptions around the world, and in Brisbane, there's also a trailblazing project there, and I think Michael and Kat are both on the call. But we've had the incredible good fortune of having Finn as a first part-time and then full-time advanced restorative justice practitioner in our service, in a dedicated role. And what that's allowed us to do is to develop a model of conferencing where we can sometimes have a conference where there is an external provider, as well as someone who's inside the system and inside the service. and who is in direct contact with clinical teams in order to be able to promote referrals, facilitate case organization, but also link with clinical teams. And so what that means is that we have embedded wellbeing assessments for patients in partnership with a clinical supporter who might be a care coordinator or a therapist. There's good communication with the clinical team through their team meetings. There is direct access to clinical records and risk assessment, and also then evidence of benefit. So we've been able to address many of the structural obstacles to being able to prepare patients and as an organization to be able to prepare our patients for an organization externally who may be working with victims in order to be able to bring them together. So the next slide then is, so that's just a little graphical representation that I put together earlier of the way in which a restorative conference might be altered by having a co-facilitator who's a health practitioner working together with the clinician, and perhaps a consultant psychiatrist or a social worker being representing the community in a conference. So that's a conference structure in a clinical context. And on the next slide, we also, because of Finn's role, we recognized that we needed to do more to support our families who had perhaps had family members in our services to be ready for restorative work with their family member. And so we have a monthly meeting that's called the Reflective Circle, where our families are able to join a virtual call with Finn and with other members of the clinical team in order for them to recognize their harm, to think about the skills that they may want to develop, like non-violent communication or non-violent resistance, in order to prepare for family dialogue. Next slide. And also we've had capacity to have a whole series of awareness raising events. So we've had theatre productions and we've had visiting speakers. And increasingly we've been able to articulate the link between being trauma informed, being harm aware, but also the importance of being anti-racist, anti-discriminatory and anti-bullying as a fundamental part of being restorative. And that's just a model or a structure for describing an awareness program that is high volume and low intensity, that prepares for a small number of conferences, but which require a scaffolding in order to make those possible. And our next slide. So we're on the last leg now. We're kind of wrapping up. And Estelle, maybe I'll take the first one and then we'll hand over. Just to say that for those services that might be interested in forensic mental health services in engaging with this work, is that we're very grateful to the Royal College for taking an interest in restorative approaches. And Finn and I have a meeting with the advisory committee for the Royal College Quality Network Standards later in May to talk about whether quality standards could include as a requirement that services have capacity or competence to enable victims to access restorative justice with their the patients who might be under our care. But what we've also been really mindful of is that the material we presented might feel quite overwhelming if you're thinking about getting started. And I think that that's where you were going to come in, Estelle, just with some trauma-informed, sympathetic thoughts about how to get started.
Was I? Okay. So just thinking, yeah, what is a huge, I'm just listening to you thinking what a huge task it is. And so if you're in a service thinking, yeah, how might we, where could we start? Just to say, we started very simply. It just might be helpful to tell that story. We started with the fact that there were people, there were incompatibilities and so-called in the system that we're in. People couldn't be together, and we just simply thought about that and thought, well, is that true? Could we not look at what harm had happened and how we might begin to dialogue about it. And I guess that's where you start, is how do you begin with a dialogue? And just picking up on Gerald's point, might you get support from a network? We have we have our own network that we would extend welcome to, or the notion of starting one ward at a time with a restorative ward. And there's some our colleagues in Kent and Medway have done some wonderful work where they've taken the whole ward through those layered principles that Gerard showed in that the onion of I don't know if it's an onion, that doesn't sound so lovely, but yes, the idea of of awareness for all, and working down to some of the very specific restorative practices, but how everybody might be on board with that in their dialoguing. And also, of course, integration into current service initiatives. So we have a good example might be the anti-bullying protocols, or we've developed restorative justice policy, which we can integrate with other work that's already ongoing. I'm going to hand back, Gerard, because I think, yes, thinking you're working particularly on co-production, co-delivery. So I'll hand over to you for the last four.
Yeah, thanks, Estelle. And you're right about the onion idea. It didn't occur to me, but you're right. It's eye-wateringly overwhelming to think about introducing something as complex as that, and that it's important to start where you are. And actually, one of the things that's really helpful for us in our service at the moment is there's a lot of energy going into the anti-bullying protocol. It's a real service priority. It's not a service priority to introduce restorative practices. That isn't being called for, but we are investing in anti-bullying. And so that's been done with our PPI leads, our patient and public initiative managers. And that's been co-produced with service users, and restorative practices and restorative principles are being fundamentally embedded in how we address the issue of bullying. And so that's been enormously empowering and helpful to us. But there have been other policies where it's been possible to seed this work. So our trust has a positive prosecution policy, and because we're trying to protect staff and make sure that harm is prosecuted where possible, but we include in that restorative options are available. So it doesn't have to just be criminal justice, but then there's also violence reduction initiatives that include restorative principles and also safeguarding. So one of the ways in which the trust has been really helpful to us is including Finn as a restorative practitioner in our mandatory training for safeguarding. So all NHS staff have to have mandatory training in safeguarding. They don't have to have mandatory training in restorative principles. And so we've, like a virus, inserted restorative practices into that area, and incredibly helpful. And then, of course, the other thing is building partnerships with external providers who are the real experts for complex and sensitive work. So we've benefited enormously from support from CALM, who has the contract for provision in London. And I know in West London, you've worked with Making Amends and other restorative providers. But I think we wanted to end really on and in a way it comes back to the sycamore tree, that what that did was it gave victims a voice in our service that it turns out they didn't really have. Even though we think a lot about victim impact, it can become quite abstract. And one of the ways in which restorative practice could be transformational of forensic mental health services, if real victims have a real voice in our settings, and not just an abstract voice where we are imagining what they might say. They give us a real feedback, and that I think it could be a form of a revolution in how we think about our services and where our duties of care lie. So I think we're going to stop there, hopefully with enough time to hear some questions and pick up on some of the comments that have come through on the chat.
Thank you very much, both. I haven't seen any questions come through on the chat, but just to invite anybody who'd like to ask a question to raise their hand. We do have around 8 minutes. Susanna, I can see you're messaging on your screen.
Hi there. Yes, thank you so much. I have one quick question. I've just done an assignment on restorative justice, and for it I went all over the world and tried to find programs of restorative justice everywhere. And it was very interesting to find I mean, it might be me doing it wrong, but I couldn't find as many restorative justice programs specifically in sort of Western Europe and America. And where it was more intended for very small crimes, whereas, you know, in places like Ireland and Spain and everywhere else in the world, a lot of places with indigenous populations that are still very active, it was much more prevalent. And is there a reason why in the places where I thought people would be really keen on restorative justice, it doesn't seem to be so prevalent, especially not for you know, more serious crimes?
I wonder maybe if I could respond to that briefly first. I mean, you're absolutely right, Zana, that in the areas where there are indigenous populations that have been harmed over time by colonization and other ways in which people have been harmed. In Canada, the residential schools has been a very significant area of work for restorative practice. But actually, even though there actually are a very large number of restorative projects, it somehow still always manages to be a bit niche. So there is a lot of work that goes on, but at a very macro national level, it can still be relatively invisible. So, for example, in the UK, the current figures of victims of crime being offered restorative justice hover somewhere between 4 and 5%. Now, that's not true in youth justice, where there's a statutory requirement to offer it, but where there is, so it's an enormous amount of work in youth justice that's required. But in the general population, it can still be relatively invisible. But I'm sure there's, you know, Catherine and other people will also perhaps want to comment on that.
I know, Susanna, when I was working in youth justice in the sort of formative years, we were given a target of 30% of young people coming through our service would be having a face-to-face meeting with their victim. On the ground, that practice was actually very limited. I think we saw lower numbers than that generally. I think it's quite difficult, I think, particularly when that experience of harm is quite fresh for somebody, because obviously the volunteerism principle of restorative justice has to ace everything.
But why? I mean, we're not a very particularly retributive society in the UK, for instance. Is it just because we're not so closely knit socially anymore? Or I was just wondering if there is a why, that, you know, and even like I found, like you said, Gerard, in Canada, but not in America. This just fascinates me why there's more. So answer.
I think it's probably an answer which is probably too wide for this particular forum. I imagine probably going back to the literature, I'm not sure if there's any literature reviews available on the uptake of restorative justice, but perhaps going back there. Sorry, we can't be more help.
No, thank you very much for.
Nicola, I can see you have your hand up.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. Every time, well, Gerard I know well, and every time I listen to you, something else is sort of triggered in my mind. And I think Estelle, it was you that was talking at the beginning about mental health and the settings that you work in around this diminished responsibility, not no responsibility. And that's huge. That's huge to me across all sorts of populations, because it links into labelling. And there's been quite a lot of talk about, you know, we're talking about mental health here and how we define those who have caused harm because they have diminished responsibility. But it doesn't mean that they have no responsibility. And I just think that's, in terms of vulnerable populations, and I guess that's been my path from having been involved in the original Thames Valley work with criminal justice populations, and our original work was with first-time offenders, so majority young people. Now having recently got a PhD in terms of restorative justice around those with special educational needs, inclusive studies, those young people excluded from the school setting, having been a teacher, having worked with young people in SEND and as a SENCO as well, that it's those, as practitioners, we're comfortable with the different vulnerable populations to help them develop the skills to understand how they've caused that harm, and to understand and develop a shared understanding about how they might be able to do something about that. And I think that's really powerful in terms of with young people. You know, that's the basis of what we should be doing in education, is the adults who quite often struggle with their own conversations and don't want to have the conversation with the parent or the conversation with the child or the conversation with the other teacher. You know, those, it's us as adults within that setting that need to be able to model and to channel those skills. So I think for me, I guess I just wanted to highlight that bit about you might be vulnerable in some way. An autistic person that I might be working with may have difficulty with social communication or with understanding empathy, but we can support them with the right people around them who understand those skills, as you do in forensic mental health, or as you might do in any other setting, the workplace, with those skills to have the difficult conversations, but to be able to also understand how their actions have damaged a relationship. And bottom line, it is about damaged relationships, isn't it? Whatever the label. So thank you. And I think just highlighting that key maybe diminished responsibility, but how can we help and actually challenge that it's not no responsibility.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you. Myra, I can see you've got your hand up. We are at 12 o'clock. I don't know if you'd like to round us off nicely, or... You're muted at the moment, Myra.
Catherine, that's kind of, I'm happy to defer with timing. It's just been excellent, and I have a load of questions. Mine are particularly around the case study that's been used by Gerard around Sycamore Tree Project, but I can drop that in a line to you, no problem.
Thank you very much, Myra.
Catherine, I know we are at 12 o'clock, but that point of no responsibility is really crucial. And I wonder if I can just land it as a practitioner. Absolutely. Because I bump into it all the time. The best gift that I can give someone is to be totally honest with them and confront that in a kind way that says, I understand there's no responsibility, you were unwell, but you had some impact at that time. And it's about understanding the impact, but also how ultimately we want to avoid it happening again. And that's anchoring an understanding about taking responsibility from here on is really important, as well as not so much for what's happened, but when I've had the conversation like that with patients particularly, they kind of get it. Often they may be a bit afraid if they really admit it or admit responsibility, then there's going to be another legal process of some sort, you know, so there's lots associated with that particular issue, and it's really important. I just thought just to speak about it from a practical point of view that, and not to be afraid of it, I suppose, because sometimes it can be a bit daunting having that conversation. But in my experience, that has opened up awakened their understanding of going, okay, yeah, I see that, because I'm the one who did that, even though I was unwell, but there's an invitation here to kind of repair that and then move forward. So
absolutely. Thank you very much, Finn. Thank you. That's a lovely way to round everything off today. I'd like to just say thank you to everyone for coming. And I can see that Joy has put the link to the evaluation form in the chat, and also links to future Mint House events. So looking forward to seeing people there as well. Thank you very much, everyone.